Well, of course, we had the Wisconsin GOP primary last night. We're going to talk about the results of that. But before we do, I want to address why we spend so much time on this election with everything else that's going on. You need to understand that this election is about the path to global governance. We've had elections in the past that have turned on things like Obamacare and other issues that are very important. But this election truly does turn on the path to global governance. It also is an election about whether or not we're going to have a calcified and corrupt political system. For the very first time in my life, we've seen a real movement that would move away from this centralization and at the same time do a real challenge to those in power. Even more serious, I believe, than the Ross Perot movement of the Reform Party. Now, when we question whether or not these results are honest or not, I've had people contact me on Twitter and saying, well, I think it's just sour grapes. I think you're being paranoid or conspiracy theorists. We're going to talk about that as well. But let's first take a look at the election last night. Now, Politico reports this and says Cruz is still facing a daunting delegate math after the win in Wisconsin. Yeah, definitely. It was interesting that in another headline, they said Cruz is surging into second place. Yeah, he's surging into second place, all right. He's been in second place, and he is firmly entrenched in second place. Let's just put it that way. Now, they say he needs four-fifths of the delegates remaining. It's a little bit more than that. Let's be precise about that. Take a look at this graphic. Of the 1,237 delegates needed to get the 50% plus one vote, there are 882 remaining. Now, if you look at this chart, we've got Trump with 743, we've got Cruz with 517, and Kasich with 143. Now, if we break that down in percentage of the remaining delegates, the 882 that are remaining, to get to that magic number, Trump needs 65% of the remaining delegates. Ted Cruz needs 82% of the remaining delegates. And of course, John Kasich needs a ridiculous 124% of the remaining delegates. Okay, that's the reality of this situation. Now, what Ted Cruz was saying with his acceptance speech last night, he said, tonight is a turning point. It's a rallying cry. It's a call from the hard-working people of Wisconsin to the people of America. Of course, there would be many more hard-working people there if Paul Ryan and others of the GOP establishment hadn't shipped their jobs abroad and imported workers. But they say, as a result of tonight, I am more and more convinced that our campaign is going to earn the 1,237 delegates needed to win the Republican nomination. No, I don't think so. He needs 82% of the remaining delegates, and about two-thirds of the states remaining are winner-take-all. The rest of them are winner-take-most. Let's go on. He says either before Cleveland or at the convention in Cleveland. He's not going to win it before Cleveland. That's pretty certain, folks. But he's hoping that he's going to get this at Cleveland. We will win a majority of the delegates. He's going to try to steal them at the convention in Cleveland. And he says, and we will beat Hillary Clinton in November, except he can't even win a majority of the GOP delegates, let alone even a plurality. He can't even get a plurality. He's way behind. If you look at the number of delegates right now, Donald Trump has 60%. He's got about 40% of the delegates. How is he going to do this? Well, he's going to be the establishment's tool. And understand, when we look at the results of Wisconsin, and when they try to tell you for the next 2 weeks, because it's going to be 2 weeks before we have another primary, the next 2 weeks are going to be filled with constant reports about the momentum of Ted Cruz surging into second place. The reality of this is that he just won the D.C. primary. Remember when you had Rubio win the D.C. caucus? Nobody paid any attention to it. It wasn't a lot of delegates. This is not a lot of delegates. It was all Washington insiders. And Wisconsin is the heart of the GOP establishment. You got Paul Ryan. You got Reince Priebus, the chair of the RNC, who's talking about how they're going to steal and select. They're going to select the candidates, not you. They're going to select it. It's their party, and you can cry if you want to, but they're going to they're going to choose whoever they wish. Now, as they're talking about Cruz wooing the GOP establishment, Politico says he's disparaged his own Republican leader as a liar. Yeah, Lion Ted called Mitch McConnell a liar. And he dismissed, that doesn't make Mitch McConnell a truth teller, by the way. A liar calling another liar a liar doesn't make the other guy, it's just not a mathematical equation. Anyway, so dismissed fellow senators as part of the quote-unquote Washington cartel. Okay, now he's also called all of his current advisors, his current foreign policy advisors, he's called all of them just a couple of months ago neocons and warmongers, and they called him on that. They said, hey, that's a pejorative term. That's a dog whistle for your supporters. Yeah, it was. It was. And his supporters don't understand that because he is now allied with the neocons. He's not wooing them, okay? He has embraced them, and he embraced them long before this moment. Now listen to what Phil Gramm, one of his supporters, former Texas Senator Phil Gramm said. When this is over, we need to be together on a set of issues we agree upon. Yeah, and they agree on these issues. He said, the good news is that while people may have conflicts with Ted, our basic leadership totally agrees with him on the issues. It's a huge difference with Trump, but we're basically all together. So understand that. The establishment agrees with Ted Cruz on the issues. They always have, they always will. He wrote the op-ed pieces with Paul Ryan talking about how they wanted the trans-Pacific, transatlantic partnerships that will destroy our sovereignty, that will manage our economy from abroad by people that we have absolutely no control over. We won't select them. We can't change the agreement, but they will change the agreement. He was in support of that. He supported the TPA the first time around when they thought they needed his vote. Later on, when he's getting closer to running for president, then he does another little move here on us, but he has basically been with them on all of the issues, all the neocon issues, all the forever war issues, all the globalist trade issues, the open border issues. Ted Cruz is with the establishment. You need to understand that. That is why they're pushing so hard against Donald Trump. Now, we have the former CIA director coming out and endorsing John Kasich, former director of the CIA, National Security. General Michael Hayden says that Governor Kasich has some serious proposals to strengthen our military to defeat ISIS, to stand up for freedom around the world. In other words, he's my kind of neocon. And this is Mr. Rogers, remember? No, he was not Mr. Rogers before he started running for president. And I think it's also interesting to see how Michael Hayden jumped to criticize Donald Trump on every issue, jumped to criticize him on torture. Donald Trump, I believe, is wrong. I think he's naive to think that we can get anything out of people when we torture them. But when he started suggesting that he would do it, Michael Hayden said, hey, the military and the other branches of the government have a duty to disobey when they're told to do something that is illegal, except they didn't do it when Michael Hayden told them it was illegal. Michael Hayden was the one who presided over the torturing. Michael Hayden was the one who was in charge of the CIA when they called it enhanced interrogation. Michael Hayden was the one who said, we need to keep this report secret. We cannot let the Senate put this out. But now he is supporting John Kasich. And of course, I think a lot of the ire of the establishment is tied to the fact that Donald Trump has questioned the idea of NATO, questioned the idea of us being the unpaid policemen of the world. And he's been questioning that for 30 plus years. He's authentic on that issue. Now, Trump spokesman has said the Bush people are running Cruz's campaign. Exactly, they are. This is a Trump spokesperson said he's a tool of the Bush family, called the Texas senator worse than a puppet. He is a Trojan horse being used by party bosses attempting to steal the nomination from Mr. Trump. And they were arguing that the Cruz campaign is being run by the party establishment. Of course it is, particularly the Bush family, and that neither Trump nor Cruz secure 1,237 delegates before the convention, they could both get duped out of the nomination. And they said the Bush people are now running Senator Cruz's campaign. Neil Bush, who spent millions of dollars, invested with Common Core, and of course so did President Bush, all these other special interest groups like Goldman Sachs, like the hedge fund managers. Nevertheless, as we look forward to New York in 2 weeks, Trump is now above the 50% mark in New York. He is at 52%, Kasich at 25%, Cruz at 17%. That tells us, once again, that Ted Cruz is not a national candidate. Okay, he's also not eligible. He's not a legitimate candidate. Kasich is also not even a serious candidate, as we saw earlier with the delegate counts. And at this level of support, Donald Trump would take all 95 delegates in New York. Now, I think it's interesting to look at the integrity of the election. And I said we were going to take a look at this. People called me a sore loser, said that I was being a paranoid conspiracy theorist. Because why? Because I said last night, as we were covering the election news, it was pretty interesting to see how we had all these polls immediately before this election, just as we did in Utah, that gave us a very, very different picture than the election itself. And if we look at the Real Clear Politics polls, and of course they take the polls that everybody else has done, they put them up there and get an average of them. We had polls ranging in the last week or so anywhere from Cruz up by 10 points to Trump up by 10 points, but most of them were Cruz up by 5 or 6 points, fine, except that, and of course our average was Cruz at a plus 4.7, yet it turned out to be Cruz at plus 13%. Now, earlier in the night, as we were talking about that, at one point he was up 30% in the polls, but he finished at 13% up. When we look at this, people always say, well, gee, how did the pollsters get it wrong? They always assume that the scientific polls were not scientific. That even though they were fairly close agreement with each other, most of them were Cruz 5, 6, 7%. Then when he doubles that, his lead, and conveniently gets even more delegates, because it was a winner take most, not winner take all, they did allocate delegates on a regional basis, on a congressional district basis. So when he jumps up in the actual election, just as he did in Utah, nobody questions if there's something fishy going on in the elections. It's always got to be the problem with the polls because, you know, the elections themselves are beyond question. We can't question what the government does. And when I look at the exit polls, one of the things that we see in foreign elections, I've mentioned over and over again, we looked at the Smartmatics company, which, by the way, is run by the guy who is the vice chairman of the George Soros Open Society Foundation. He's also been the vice president of the World Bank. It's either the World Bank or the IMF. Nevertheless, he has connections to the globalists, and he's been involved, this company has been involved with multiple elections in multiple countries where they questioned whether there was fraud or not. One of the things that they did in Brazil was to make sure that there was no exit polling to kind of do a cross-check on what had happened at the polls. Wouldn't you think that with everybody all massed in one place, it'd be very easy to do selective polling of just certain regions and say, you know what, the reports that we got from these precincts don't match what the people coming out said that they voted for. That's been done in other countries, but when they have fraud, they shut that down. And they don't do that here in America. I looked at exit polls for Wisconsin, and I got a lot of hits, but they tell you things like, well, exit polls say that Cruz wins on fear of Trump, or the GOP voters want a nominee that's like this, or they're excited, or they're scared about this. They give you demographics about it. They tell you what they're thinking, but they don't tell you who they said they voted for. Don't you find that interesting? I find it interesting. When I look at Wisconsin, and I look at these problems that we have here, U.S. News reports the problems with polls, and they say, well, once a seemingly infallible cornerstone of the political system, recently public opinion polls have wrapped up big-time failures, embarrassments that compelled a leading firm to conduct an internal audit to find out what went wrong, okay? Nobody does an internal audit of the actual election itself. As a matter of fact, when we look at what happened in Wisconsin, we've had multiple elections in Wisconsin itself where people believe that they've been rigged. I'm not the first one to say this. And they talk about the different ways that you can rig the elections, and we've mentioned this many times ourselves. You can have optical scanners, for example. This report from the Wisconsin Citizens Media Cooperative says with optical scanners, they've had a situation in Medford, Wisconsin, where programming error lost over 25% of the votes in 2004. Of course, they can also get different results each time they run the same ballots through these optical scanners. Or there can be human manipulation. Or then you get to the touchscreen voting machines. Who programs the proms? Who programs the electronics in them? Well, you're not allowed to see. Unlike a slot machine at Las Vegas or Atlantic City, where you have to have the software registered, where people can come there and verify that the software that's on the machine is actually what's been registered. No, it's a trade secret, and you can't inspect it on site, and anybody can modify that. But we'd be foolish to question the honesty of our elections. This is what Roger Stone had to say about this earlier today on the Alex Jones Radio Show.
First of all, I have been looking at a very interesting quick study comparing the polling results with the actual results as reported by the state of Wisconsin on a finite district by district basis. It is literally scientifically impossible for there to be this broad a swing between the polling results and the final results. Now, the Walker machine has always been adept at vote stealing. Richard Charnin, a respected mathematician, by the way, a man of the left, but someone I respect for candor, has done yeoman work on a monograph showing how the Walker machine has stolen votes in past gubernatorial races and in a past recall. So I suspect funny business in Wisconsin. Secondarily, I would ask the folks who are with us here today, send an email to msnbc.com and let them know you won't put up with Soviet-style censorship, that you believe in free speech, you believe in the First Amendment, and the idea of banning people like Roger Stone because I am politically incorrect is an outrage.